Hello, everyone. I am Andrew Carter, and I'm here with Michael Broerman, and we are both from Live for Live Music. And we are here with a very special guest, David Gans. Welcome, David.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And now, for those of you who may not know David yet, David is the host of the weekly syndicated radio show, The Grateful Dead Hour. David also co-hosts the weekly call-in show, Tales from the Golden Road, on the Grateful Dead's channel on Sirius XM with Gary Lambert. And David and Gary also hosted the Dead Air interview segments that used to be broadcast during the set breaks of live stream Dead and Company shows on Nugs. And David is also a prolific writer, photographer, and songwriter, and that's actually why we're here to talk to him today, to talk about David's new book, Improvised Lives, Grateful Dead 1972 to 1985, which is an incredible collection of photos from those years. Now, I can start by saying the day the book landed with me, I was blown away by what I saw. Because even if you're somebody who's seen just about everything that there is to see, or at least you think you haven't seen what's in this book. And so we knew that we wanted to talk to you about the book, and we wanted to do two things to make this happen. Is first, let's flip the script that you used on Dead Air and have two people interview you. And
Okay.
secondly, we wanted to widen the scope of the discussion, but I wanted to get Michael involved because by him being here, there are three generations of Deadheads involved in the conversation. And I thought it was just like it's the book is that big, so let's do this. And
That's I appreciate your kind words and everything that's going on right now. This is feeding into my state of mind as I prepare to teach a class about the Grateful Dead for Stanford continuing education. This came up just in the last couple of weeks, Andrew, since we started talking about this, and I
oh,
just signed the deal, as it were. And it's quite a fascinating thing. And so, like everything, I'm trying to figure out how to distill this into 6 evenings, like how to structure it. And I'm making pretty good progress. But every
oh,
conversation that I have right now is generating useful information as I prepare my syllabus, etc. So, Michael, you're going to be a bit of an interviewee as this goes as well.
Wow.
well, let's kick it off, man. Let's go.
Yeah. Yeah, talking about improvised lives. First of all, just even before we get into the questions, love the book. Like as Andrew said, no matter how well you know the Grateful Dead, you haven't seen these things because also there's a huge component of this that is so personal. It's like, especially with having your introductions to each chapter, it's like sitting down and going through like a photo album with you. It's been great. And also because it helps that we can all hear your voice, having heard it for so long.
That's interesting that you say that. I credit Jay Blakesberg with the impetus to write more. My thought had been to make it more photographic, and he said, "Oh no, you got to tell the stories behind it." So it was Jay's prodding that led to so many of those stories being included and expanded upon as they were.
That's interesting that that came from someone who's also a noted photographer like Jay Blakesberg. And I think it kind of probably echoes from his project last year, Retro Blakesberg, which is a really interesting photo book. But
Well,
anyway,
Jay
sorry.
wrote a foreword for this book and explained. He outlines really what you observed correctly that my path through this weird little world is really unique, and nobody else got or could have gotten some of these photos that I have, and that's really what it's documenting. I've got myself into that orbit in various ways at various times, and it was an amazing experience.
I think that's something that even points out that is very much of a note of the fact that these pictures from Bob's home, from Phil's home, at Brent's home, these were all these things were done without the intermediary of a publicist. And so that's actually something that I want to get into with my first question is myself being a young music journalist, this firsthand account of your kind of rise to prominence is really inspiring. But obviously, with like the whole lack of a publicist, with so many other factors, you came up in a very different media landscape than we have today, than I came up with. Do you think that your story could be repeated? Could it happen again in today's climate?
Probably not with the Grateful Dead, but with some other band. I mean, this they were fairly accessible at the time that I started, that I became, I came to them first as a fan, which of course didn't involve any direct contact. And then as a journalist, when I started writing about the Dead for BAM magazine, along with my general music reporting and stuff. And it was you could go to the Dead office and hang out, and you might run into somebody there. Dick Latvala was very famously hanging out in the doorway of Eileen Law's office on the second floor of Fifth and Lincoln, raving about Primal Dead. When Phil Lesh walked up behind him, heard the conversation, and that led to Dick becoming the archivist. So I mean, that was you could walk in right off the street at various times and connect with that world in various ways. And I was very eager to do so, of course. So I arrived there as a journalist, but pursued every avenue that I could. At the same time I was being a journalist, I was also becoming a Deadhead and meeting people like Ed Pearlstein, who's contributed a couple of photos from this, from our mutual adventures in the Grateful Dead world. Ed was turning me on to the world of tape trading and making me copies of important Grateful Dead shows and stuff, and bringing me up to speed, as various other people did too. There was a famous Dead tape trader named Bob Menke, taper and tape trader named Bob Menke, who was also incredibly generous with his collection and stuff. So I was getting up to speed and working my way into that world just as obsessively as every other young Deadhead. It just happened that I had some skills to bring to the party as well, and that led to my having, more interesting forms of access.
And yeah, and I guess you'd been interviewing and covering the Grateful Dead and its members from 1977 onward, and then you mentioned in 1981 things would actually take a bit of a turn when you finally got to interview Phil Lesh. And I guess even by that point, Phil was reticent about giving interviews, but you did something that a lot of people didn't.
I don't know. I was the Grateful Dead weren't entirely without publicists. There was a gentleman named Zon Artman who was their publicist in the early '80s, who had come to their world from Bill Graham's world. Very interesting character, lovely man. And I believe that he and his partner Julie Milburn are the ones that persuaded Phil to talk to me, that I would to do an interview for Musician magazine, that I was a musician who knew about the Grateful Dead, and that I wouldn't be wasting his time. And so, I mean, that's really all that it was at first. And the first episode of that interview took place in June of 1981. And Phil sat down with me and told me his story. It was a wonderful experience. And then I don't know exactly, I'd have to go back and see if I have any contemporaneous notes from it. But somehow the next installment of that interview didn't happen until a year later. And then I had another sit down, very in-depth interview with him. About his musicianship and about his history and about his, his contributions to the Grateful Dead and what it all meant. And at one point in there, he's talking to me about Beethoven or conductor scores or something, and he said, "Man, you really should come up to the house and look at the conductor scores for these things." And I don't remember what it was about, because I was in completely over my head with him about these classical music things. But of course, I said yes. And accepted the invitation. And as I wrote in the book, it was like being invited to go smoke a joint with your favorite professor in college, right? Which I also got to do once. So that led to my having something of a personal relationship with Phil. It lasted several years. And he recognized that I was a musician and that I understood what they were doing sufficiently that I wouldn't be wasting his time in conversation. And I think he figured that I could, do them some good, to have somebody out there explaining what they do, or who understood what they do, helping to present their thing to the world. Because in the early '80s, the Grateful Dead weren't widely appreciated, nearly as widely appreciated as they are now. They were, I think, financially solvent and doing reasonably okay in their existence next door to the music business, But I don't think and it was already a time when Jerry had a hard time going out on the street and stuff, I mean, that sort of thing had already been happening, but it wasn't the completely insane global thing that it became years later.
Well, the book was, I guess, in the book you actually did have some contemporaneous notes, because in the 1981 interview, you actually, Phil at one point stopped the interview and said, "Man, you really did your homework," and that was
Oh,
actually what turned everything.
well, I think that was, I remember that because I was talking to him about, I think it might have been about there had been a very interesting experience or interesting moment at one of the gigs at the Oakland Stadium in October of 1976. They were in the first set. They were winding up the first set and playing that nice sort of funk version of Dancing in the Streets that they had started doing in 76. And they were jamming along and suddenly they were playing Wharf Rat. It was just this beautiful thing. And it's felt to me completely spontaneous. And it was the sort of thing that guys like me live for. By that time I'd been playing Grateful Dead music with a bunch of guys for years, and we had our own version of that conversation going on. And one of our modes, or one of our sort of rules, was that I always, not a rule, but one of my preferences all along was, let's do Scarlet Begonias into something besides Fire on the Mountain. Let's do something else into I Know You're Right. You know what I mean? Let's not do the same pairings that everybody always did and treat them as if they were a single composition, which is fine and valid. And obviously it worked for the Grateful Dead and it works for a lot of people that play their music. But what I wanted to do is have the conversation in our own voice and move the music in its own direction and take it off from there and not know where we were going to go and things like that. So I mentioned that because it was the sort of thing that I lived for, and I think Phil acknowledged that that it came as a surprise to them too. But I also think, in looking back, I'd have to go back and look this up, but I think they tried doing it again a few gigs later. I may be misremembering that, but I think they might have done it again. But it was, I think he recognized, maybe, if I'm remembering this correctly, and remember this is 40 blanket years ago, that I think he recognized there that I was somebody who was listening closely and appreciated the, that thing that they were doing. Because what the world didn't really understand about the Grateful Dead was that they were speaking a very, very particular and very lush language among them, and it was their conversation that we were privy to that was what made this music so interesting. They were playing the song differently every time, and they were bringing their authentic selves to the music one way or another, each of them, and the music reflected the personalities, or we thought they reflected the personalities, or they reflected the apparent personalities of those guys, and that's what made it so compelling to us. So I think he recognized that I was somebody that was attuned to the musical aspects of that, where for the most part they tended to see people that were responding more to the social and other aspects of it.
Mhm. Yeah, you actually even mentioned something that I wanted to get into next. Something that actually we had talked about when I interviewed you last year for Live for Live Music. It actually became the title of that piece was "Tell the Story in Your Own Voice." And just it's definitely seems to be a recurring theme, and it works out really well that when you kind of came into knowing Phil and getting in with the rest of the band, you had been a songwriter for well over a decade by that point. You had your own voice, you already had your own kind of style, and so you didn't fall into a trap that people that are doing kind of the jam band scene in my generation, like a lot of people grew up with the Grateful Dead, and so whether implicitly or explicitly, that those songs become a part of your own voice.
Yeah.
Whereas you already had your own voice by that time. How do you think your artistic development could have changed? Your artistic maturity may have been different had you found the Grateful Dead earlier.
I, the earlier I don't, it doesn't matter to me. Where in fact, I think it's probably better that I found them after I'd spent several years becoming a musician in my own right, so that I didn't succumb to it. A lot of people, when they start playing, they pick up a guitar and they want to get girls, or they want to play guitar and they want to learn those hot licks and stuff, and they go and they learn all the licks off of other people's records and they impersonate other people in a way. And some of them figure out how to start doing their own thing and developing their own style, and some of them don't. and the world and the music business as they're currently constituted rewards the tribute bands and stuff a lot more than they reward the creators of original music, at least in where in the areas that I have access to. And it's not a value judgment in any way. I grew up telling my own stories, and the Grateful Dead opened me up in so many directions. They introduced me to so many different styles of music, and more importantly, to that conversational way of making music, and that it permanently expanded my universe. And I consider myself a direct descendant of the Grateful Dead, in that my performances can be explained the same way that theirs can. A combination of original music, interpreted music, and improvisation, giving all three more or less equal weight.
Nice. Very cool. And now, in jumping back to the book and to talking about what had happened with Phil, jumping 1 year forward to 1982, things continued to move forward, and you got two really two of I think my favorite chapters in the book were when you got to go to the US Festival and Labor Day weekend of 1982, and then 3 months after that, you went to the Jamaica World Music Festival, which was another major turn for you behind the scenes. And I was wondering if you could talk about those two trips.
Yeah. I was a music journalist, and I was working for a mainstream music magazine called Record. I had started out at BAM Magazine, which was a free biweekly in the Bay Area, many of whose staff are still dear friends of mine. Blair Jackson and Regan McMahon live right down the street, and we're very close friends to this day. But I was also working for other magazines. I worked for Mix, which was a recording industry magazine. They had a musical instruments oriented, like professional musician oriented magazine that they hired me for. And then when it closed down, they folded that music stuff into the main book. So I became the music editor of Mix magazine. And through a colleague there, I was introduced to Record magazine just as they were beginning publication. And I got on board as their musical instruments columnist for their first issue, which I think it's November 81. It's either November 80 or November 81. I think it must have been 81. So I began as a contributor, and over the next several years, I wound up as a senior editor, and wound up getting to do a lot of really fun stuff, like interview Neil Young and fly to Florida to interview Rod Stewart and things like that. So I had a great time being a mainstream rock music journalist during a time when record companies had budgets to sway guys like me. And two of those gigs were the US Festival. I went there as a journalist with a press credential such as it was, but as it happened, it was a Bill Graham Presents backstage, and it was Jensen Roberts' communication publicity team. And I was just tight friends with all of those people. So so were a lot of other people. I was not, there was just tons of people backstage, foreign press, weirdo press, us press, different kinds of people watching all this weird stuff go on. And there was this intrigue happening. Steve Wozniak, the Apple co-founder who funded the whole thing and had these sort of bizarre visions of social improvement with the whole thing. He and a bunch of his Silicon Valley hacker friends started defeating the backstage access systems. So every 2 hours or so, they come around and say, you got to put this blue sticker on your laminate now. I mean, it was just this weird ass weekend going on. But I got a ride in a helicopter because of it, And
those incredible aerial shots.
Yeah, I mean, I got to ride in a helicopter with my camera. It was such a wonderful thing. But I also was backstage and watched all this weird stuff going on. And there was a press conference in the back where Bobby and Mickey sat in folding chairs in a pond backstage. It was so fucking hot out there. And the rest of us, and there's actually a photo of me playing in the band. I'm in the front row holding out my tape recorder, I think, of the press people on the bank of the little creek or whatever it is, while Bobby and Mickey are holding their press conference. It was just an amazing experience in incredibly hot weather, watching all this weird stuff go on, hearing tons of amazing music. I mean, Talking Heads and Jackson Browne, and God, it was fantastic. And the other thing was the Jamaica World Music Festival. And again, I was there on a press junket because I was the editor of a major national music magazine, not because I was a deadhead. But I was a deadhead on a press junket in the guise of a writer for a major music magazine. So I was bunking with my good buddy G. Brown from the Denver Post. And G, by the way, is now the executive director of the Colorado Music Experience.
Right.
An amazing human being, a great writer, and somebody you all should know. Anyway, me and him just had the greatest time. The Jamaica World Music Festival was like 3 days. The Beach Boys and Joe Jackson and Gladys Knight and the Pips and Jimmy Cliff and Bobby and the Midnights and the Grateful Dead. And it was just incredible. And everything ran so late that all the shows finished after dawn. So we didn't want to waste any daylight sleeping. So we just didn't sleep for 3 days and had this great time. And while I was down there, I met John Perry Barlow, the lyricist for the Grateful Dead, who I'd never met before. And he gave me an interview at the hotel, which wound up in the book Conversations with the Dead in 1991. I also met the photographer Peter Simon. He was staying at the Press Junket Hotel where G and I were staying and all the other writers. And he was there with his editor, Bob Miller, for St. Martin's Press, and they were starting to work on a book about the Grateful Dead. And I schmoozed him up. I was a freelance writer and photographer, you know. I thought I might be able to contribute some photos or whatever. And I made friends with both of them, and we had a nice hangout. And then some weeks or months later, I got a call from them asking if I was interested in doing the text for Peter's book. And I said, of course I'm interested in doing the text for Peter's book. And so I signed on to co-author the book that was published in the spring of '85 as Playing in the Band, an oral and visual portrait of the Grateful Dead. I wrote the text, contributed some of the photos, and Peter did this immense and wonderful job of photo editing of the book.
He did. And somebody also whispered in their ear about you down in Jamaica too, didn't they?
Oh, you're spilling all my secrets. Yes. What I didn't find out until much later was that they had met with Phil Lesh down there and that Phil had advised them to hire me to write the text. I was immensely flattered, obviously, when I found that out. So it's one of many episodes in my life of opportunities that presented themselves to me through no particular initiative of my own that wound up being life changers. And that one, you know, lucking into meeting those guys and being down there and being in the right place at the right time. And then when the opportunity arose, it never occurred to me to say, you know, hey, why don't you hire me to do the text? I thought they might buy a photo or two from me, you know.
Yeah, between kind of that Phil Lesh interview being, you know, a flashpoint, like a kind of breakthrough moment for you with the rest of the band, and then flash forward to this, it really sounds like kind of getting Phil's seal of approval was very important in your getting like access to this and kind of steamrolling into where you're at now.
Well, steamrolling is an odd value-laden word, but okay. I mean, being Phil's protege. I mean, I was a working journalist and stuff too, so I wasn't just a hanger-on. And I didn't want to be just a hanger-on. I mean, I saw the hangers-on, you know, and I didn't want to be one. I was a working musician and a working journalist, and I wanted to be a deadhead connected to those people, but not at the expense of my dignity, you know. So I wanted to find a niche. I wanted to find things that I could do to be useful. And so at that time, as Bobby was doing a lot of stuff with Bobby and the Midnights, you know, recording and playing with those guys. So I kind of became a pet journalist to them during that period, because I'd come and hang out, I'd take pictures, and I would, you know, write them up for magazines and things like that. So I was making myself useful and showing up as a press person who was sympathetic to them. But I feel, I don't recall exactly, I guess he just Yeah, figured that I was an asset to the enterprise and put me down for a laminate, and so I got to hang out on stage and stuff for a few years.
Hmm. And as we're
And
talking about that, and then coupled with as we're moving through the history of the Grateful Dead into the mid 1980s, you were kind of in a position towards your end of like before getting into the Deadhead Hour, but in like the mid 80s, you're kind of witness a little bit to a little bit of a downward spiral. I mean, within the band of just drugs being more prevalent, like Jerry
Yeah.
Garcia just being more involved with that. And so, what was that experience like of just being a fan, being like a musician, being a like collaborator with the band, and seeing that go on while you're also being tasked with, to a certain extent, helping spread this message of helping that band with your platform while you are aware that things are not completely good at Mission Control.
I was never in a position where I had to tell any secrets. My journalism was music industry oriented. It wasn't, personal, and it wasn't about their lives. It was about their work. And so I wasn't really in a position where I had to spill any beans. I was privy to this and that and witnessed various things, and it was a sad time for a lot of people. Jerry was not healthy and was unwilling to receive help at various times. Like in '82, in particular, his legs got all swollen up, and they tried to get a nurse in there to take a blood sample or something like that. I mean, it was a sad time. And hanging around Front Street, there was a lot of concern among people. And then he'd show up and he'd play, and everything was fine or fine enough. And in that world, it was also, lots of other people were doing lots of other drugs too at various times. Jerry was the fulcrum of the whole thing. So his debilities, the compromises of his sharpness, had a more widespread effect. But part of the morality of that world was that you couldn't really bust anybody else's chops, because nobody was clean.
fair enough. Well, actually, and I can sort of follow up to that. And I mean, you got to you got to see at least some of the difficulties that things did cause, but the other thing is that you did get to see a lot more behind the scenes. You got to know people behind the scenes a bit better. And I'm wondering, in particular, what was it like to get to know Brent Midland during his earlier years in the band? Because you got to interview him for playing in the band, and he wasn't somebody who did a lot of interviews. And you were there as he developed into the band and really started and really developed as a player. And you got to know him a bit really before things maybe started to get to him a little later on.
I didn't have that much contact with him. I did several interviews with him, two longer ones and I think a few shorter ones. But I didn't spend time, and I did go out to his house on two occasions to take pictures, but I didn't socialize with him, and I didn't interact with him much at the shows either, because I was, my real sponsor on stage was Phil, and to a lesser extent I spent time with Bob, but I didn't socialize with the rest of them that much. And so I didn't, and I did Brent was a different, he had his own life outside of that, I guess is how you put it. And I just didn't cross paths with him except on stage for the most part.
Right. Well, I know the photos that you got of him at home were, I mean, they were, and I think it was one of the things that Jay wrote in the forward in the book. He said many of the photos here are just surprisingly intimate in their
Yeah.
scope, things like that. And I think one of the themes of this book overall is that they're just all these just wonderful behind the scenes photos when you see the guys dropping their guard and just acting in ways that they would normally not act when they know that a camera is being pointed at them. They were more relaxed.
I had really, really good fortune that way. I was a known quantity, I guess, in certain quarters, and I was trusted, that I wasn't going to do anything untoward with the images, and I wasn't. I was part of that world, and I had a camera. I wasn't there as a photographer, but I often had my camera with me, And so I was able to take those pictures. And the funnest ones to me are the Furman Sound one and the Simba Talking Drum ones, where I was actually hired and summoned over there to take pictures to be used in magazine ads. So that was Bill Kreutzmann posing for me with the talking
Right.
drum. And it's Jerry Garcia holding up a piece of Furman gear and those pictures. And Jesus Christ, I did it out in the bright sun and he's squinting. They're just shitty photographs, but it was all the Furman needed, I guess, at the moment. It was all that was I don't know how I got away with it, but those photos are that way because yeah, they knew me. I was hanging out. I wasn't a total noob arriving there to crash their scene. I was familiar to everybody. The roadies tended to grumble about me, but they grumbled about everything. I basically got to do what I needed to do. And it was really fun being part of it. But it was also, I have to say, it was okay when that part of my life wound down.
Mhm.
And when I got into the radio thing in the mid '80s, it really changed my relationship with that world because not only did I have a place in it, a niche in it, with a contract and everything that gave me access to whatever, but it also was a full-time job. And it cut seriously into my schmoozing time, and it cut seriously into my traveling to see shows time. So it changed my life as a deadhead, and that's why the book ends at 1985. I became a stay-at-home radio producer in the middle of 1985, and the rest of my freelance magazine writing career just kind of wound down, and the radio show became my main gig. It just kind of it just happened that way.
Mhm. And kind of talking about more the broader legacy of the band. I think one of the things I really enjoyed reading in the book was your essay about Dawn of the Deadheads, where
Yeah.
talking about you know, as the tribe's starting to get more coverage, people are starting to realize like, hey, there's all these deadhead people walking around. And it's a really thoughtful just reflection on what this whole culture is. And that was a good 40 or so years ago. And so I'm
That's
just
right.
curious from your perspective, what have you seen change specifically with the fans, with the culture? Are we still really connected to that hippie tribe? Like, if anything, these days, sometimes what I see, to use some of your language, is sometimes I see more of the brethren in straight disguises than the tie-dyed, saucer-eyed folks.
I don't I don't know. I mean, the original hippie tribe still exists in all of its guises around the world. Various people have aged out of it, but there's also ones that are into their fourth and fifth generations. That's almost a separate question. The dead culture has grown and immensely over the years. I mean, when Jerry died in '95, one of the reasons I started touring nationally as a musician was that I figured the radio show wasn't going to last forever. With Jerry gone, it was all going to kind of wind down, and that it was time for me to stop being a famous deadhead and start getting out there to push my own music. So it was that pushed me out into the world, and for very much a positive development in my life. But I did not expect that the Grateful Dead hour would still be going on in 2023, and I did not expect that there would be an act selling out stadiums playing this music in 2023, and I did not predict that there would be bottles of wine with the Grateful Dead logo on them, and Beanie Babies, and resorts in South America. And I mean that the culture, the branding, the identity has become incredibly widespread. And as those guys in the band, I think, observed years and years ago, it took on an identity and a weight of its own that was almost separate from the band, and in a certain way disconnected from the music as well. The culture became a thing of its own and completely beyond the control of any individual. More to the point, and to take it back to my declared department, The musicians are all still making music. Bob Weir's just doing. He's been forging on all this time, and he's out there doing improvisation with orchestras. It's an amazing thing, and he's a visionary to be trying to do it and succeeding at doing it. And that's, this is the through line of the life that started on New Year's Eve of 1964 when him and his buddy ran into Jerry Garcia in the back of Dana Morgan's music. That, and Bill Kreisman is still out there playing with guys 30 years, 40 years younger than him, and Mickey Hart is still doing things, playing with his world music stuff. Phil Lesh is he launched his son and a whole another generation of musicians into this musical universe. And bands all over the country are playing this music. Those songs are their own genre of folk music now.
Now, David, it's a known thing. I guess one of the things that struck me getting into the text that you wrote. I mean, it's almost like sort of almost like a mini memoir of your time within this scene. I know it's kind of a known thing that you've been present for a lot of Grateful Dead history, just by virtue of the fact that you've been broadcasting and just doing all of this so long. But I didn't realize the full extent of just exactly how much you were there. And you go into the detail about it, where you saw, the Grateful Dead played the Greek Theater 27 times in the 1980s, and you made 26. There were 58 shows at the Oakland Auditorium / Henry J. Kaiser Auditorium. You were at 57 of those. And not only that, but like of the 15 Bill Graham produced New Year's Eve spectaculars, you saw all of them except 2, and you even got to be professionally involved with 3 of them.
There's nothing particularly extraordinary about that. I know dozens of other people who could for whom all of those statistics are accurate. And there's so many people who've been to so many more shows than I have. That's just being a deadhead in the Bay Area. We were so blessed to have that much, Grateful Dead available to us. Of course, I went to as many as I could.
Well, I was an East Coast head, so I was jealous. I mean, we didn't get, it was nice if you were in the Bay Area, you could see that, a dozen times a year and wake up in your own bed. And
yes, that's very true, and I know how fortunate we were.
Yeah, that was just, I was, if I'd been in the Bay Area, I would have done it too. But it was just, the number, although nobody was keeping count really, but it was impressive, and it was, but more just to the point, you got to be professionally involved with the production of 3 of the big New Year's shows.
I did. Because I had started doing the Deadhead Hour on KFOG, and I had been cutting tape, making montages, little psychedelic, quick cut montages of various musical things. Bill Graham and his producing partner, Peter Barsotti, invited me to produce the soundtracks for Bill's New Year's Eve pageant. This was started in 1986. And it was a fabulous experience. I mean, Bill had developed this over the years, this thing of doing a pageant at New Year's Eve, that the countdown would include Bill traveling to the stage in some costume, from hanging from the ceiling or on a float across the floor or whatever. And it was a different theme every year, and there was a huge amount of audience participation in it and a lot of crew people. And it was a huge pageant, a huge amount of fun, which, by the way, overshadowed the music to a great extent on New Year's Eve, which is why a lot of people preferred December 30th shows overall. But I got to attend. They had created the costume in '86. Bill was going to be the American Eagle from the presidential seal and fly across the ceiling in a harness. And they had timed this. They had done a few dry runs of it. So Peter came over to my house with this timing and a list of stuff we wanted stuff he wanted included, elements he wanted included in it. and in those days, this involved getting out albums, CDs, which weren't all that widespread yet in those days, getting the tapes and music and stuff out and recording onto little short stretches of tape, marking it with grease pencil, and then splicing it together with razor blades, and this several times per second for a several minute presentation. Not all of it was super quick cuts, but it would be a line from a song. There was just a little interjection from Cyndi Lauper in one of them. There's a little Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young. There was the Chambers Brothers' Time Has Come Today. It was a fabulous experience to work with Peter. And in the middle of it, he says to me, just remember, you're doing this for 10,000 people who are tripping balls. And so I just thought, okay, I could rise to that challenge. So I got to do that. There's 86, and for that was at the Henry J. And then 87 and 88 were at the Oakland Coliseum Arena, where we got to do it for 15,000 people that were tripping balls. It was really, really, really fun to be part of it, to work closely with Bill and Peter. Peter was an amazing guy. He died a few years ago from cancer. He was a really incredibly creative, hugely energetic guy, and he was like Bill's primary counterpart in the making of these pageants. They were the guys that saw to it that the backstage scene at the Oakland Stadium for Day on the Green was a pleasant place for the Who to hang out, things like that. They just saw that the ambience, that the customers also, the people that went to shows got to see beautiful stages and all that stuff. Peter and his brother Bob were Bill's principal lieutenants, and especially in the Grateful Dead concert thing. So working with these guys who were just so deeply committed to this fabulous psychedelic moment that happened to also be the peak of Bill's existence every year was just a real treat.
Nice.
And then a couple of years later, I got to work on the New Year's Eve broadcast in '90. I sort of hung around. I was friends with the people that did the K-Fog one in like '88 or whatever. So I hung around, but I wasn't a host on those. I hosted, I can't remember what was what, but in '90 and '91, we did global live broadcast from the Oakland Coliseum Arena. Produced by Dan Healy himself, the Grateful Dead sound guy, and I had the great honor and privilege of being part of the on-air crew those 2 years. The '91 was particularly wonderful, and it began our relationship with the amazing and late great Ken Nordine, who we called. You just look him up, people, on Wikipedia. He was an amazing character and had a tremendous voice. And we called him to do an ID for us, and he wound up coming over to Oakland and co-hosting the show with us. And we also got to do it again in '91, but Bill Graham died in a helicopter crash in October of '91. So the New Year's Eve '91 show happened without Bill, and the Dead never played another New Year's Eve after that. So my career as a New Year's Eve broadcaster ended when the Grateful Dead stopped playing New Year's Eve. But yeah, getting to be on the crew for these things was just another part of the magic of this thing. You get to work with incredible people. You got to be part of, my job on the Grateful Dead Radio Hour for 38 years now has been to shovel this stuff out into the universe so that people can find it for free and get their lives changed. And people come up and tell me that all the time. It's one of my favorite things about going out into the world and doing Dead related stuff is people come up to me and say, you're the reason I'm a Deadhead. I used to hear you on WXRT, and I thought, thank you. It's been an honor and a privilege, and I hope your parents have forgiven me.
And kind of wrapping up here, really kind of ending this interview with something you kind of touched on it already. But I'm curious, how do you see yourself in the context of the Grateful Dead history? Because Andrew said you witnessed so many of these moments, and then you became a part of these moments, and then now you're curating these moments.
My participation, my direct participation in Grateful Dead history is really, really quite limited. I was on the periphery of various things and along for the ride on various things, but I was in no way central to any of the important events in the Grateful Dead's world. It was a pleasure just to be nearby and to be peripheral to some of them. My proudest contributions to the Grateful Dead world are 2.5 lines of Bob Weir songs, 2 songs I got to co-write with Robert Hunter, and getting to co-produce some of the most important compilations of Grateful Dead and Jerry Garcia related music. That's the stuff that being a hands-on creative partner with the Grateful Dead is the thing that matters to me the most, and those are the moments I'm proudest of.
Nice. And yeah, and I guess those were all things that I guess we're about out of time, and those were all things that we were on that was on the list of things to talk about, but we only just touched on them now. But they are you go into more detail in them in the book, and I guess we want to finish up with how does somebody go and get this book?
My online store is called perfectible.net, perfectible.net, which is also the name of the record company that I've been using to release my own music and various other things over the last 25 years. And I have 2 other books for sale in that store as well. This is All a Dream We Dreamed, an oral history of the Grateful Dead, which I wrote with Blair Jackson, and Conversations with the Dead, and they're all available on that site along with a bunch of my CDs. And there's also a tip jar there. I play a live set online every afternoon pretty much. There are exceptions when I have to do something out of the house, but pretty much almost every day at 4 o'clock California time, 7 o'clock Eastern time, I play a live set from the studio right where I'm sitting, in fact, as I speak to you now. I play original music. I do a lot of improvising. As I said earlier, I play originals, interpretations of other people's music, and improvisation, all given equal weight in the mix of my performances. And I do all this other stuff in between doing that every day. And I want to thank you guys so much for letting me blather for so long.
Absolutely. Yeah, and by the way, for anyone who's trying to think ahead, this is a really good holiday gift if you need to buy something for a day thing and don't.
Signed copies.
Signed copies, and it's a lot more affordable than you think it might be. So, highly recommend that. But yeah, David, thank you for taking the time to speak with us, and thanks for putting this book out. Very.
Thank you both so much, and I appreciate your kind attention.
All right. Thank you, David.